And finally this morning, I'd like to go on to my good friend Shahina Braganza, who's going to talk about that very small topic, surviving moral injury.
Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you, Bubbles, for having us along as RAP. We are really thrilled to be here. I think it's fair to say that our systems were under pressure long before the pandemic. And COVID-19 has simply pushed us over the edge. This is not a talk about individual or team-based solutions to the challenges of working in the system. This potentially career-limiting talk is about it's about individual and team-based survival strategies when working within these broken systems. And I guess it aims to increase our awareness and perhaps to equip us with a language so that we can understand better the psychological distress of working within these systems. In the last 2 years, we have been celebrated as heroes, as healthcare heroes. Never before has the humanity, perhaps the humanness that lies at the core of being a healthcare worker, been in such sharp focus. And along with this acknowledgement of humanity has come a recognition of the fact that we are vulnerable. There's been an acknowledgement, a recognition perhaps of courage, of generosity, maybe even of nobility. We have been celebrated as frontline workers, healthcare heroes. But we know, don't we, that we don't always feel like heroes. Some of the time, we feel more like battle-weary and wounded soldiers. We are physically, emotionally, and morally exhausted, perilously close to the jaws of defeat, maybe on the brink of collapse. Sometimes it feels like the only thing that keeps us coming back is habit, or maybe a sense of duty to our patients, but even a duty to our colleagues. Or it may be that in order to figure out what else we might do with ourselves would take an effort for which we have no capacity currently. And if my casual conversations with colleagues and dear friends over the last 24 hours are anything to go by, some of us are actually choosing to not come back. Some of us are choosing to cut back our hours. Earlier this year, I was on a shift, and my role was that of medical commander. It's a role that kind of provides a little bit of overview on the emergency department. It has high responsibility, high accountability, a fluid job description, a fairly sketchy sense of control. And it was mid-morning on a weekend day, and a man came in. I'm going to call him Ed. Ed had had a trivial immersion in the surf that morning, and he was now complaining of pretty severe throat pain. The nurses were concerned about him, and they brought him into our triage area. I was in the middle of assessing another patient, and I saw him out of the corner of my eye. He looked really uncomfortable, belching and rubbing at his throat. And I think I asked for an ECG, I'm not 100% sure, and I said that I'd be right there. And then my phone went off, and I was called out to the newly erected ambulance tent in order to review a man with a petechial rash. And I made some decisions there, and then I trudged back to our triage area towards Ed, but I was deflected to go and see a patient who was kicking off on the ambulance ramp. She was behaviorally disturbed. And just as I was giving my verbal order for the 10 milligrams of IM droperidol, the resus buzzer went off in triage chair 2, the chair that I knew Ed was sitting in. So I rushed over. Ed was having a seizure. Actually, Ed was having a cardiac arrest. I had missed his ST elevation MI. What followed was a myriad of emotion. Shame, predominantly. Fear, for Ed and for his family, and also for me. Humiliation, there was a very public resus after that. And sadness, because even though I hadn't met Ed, he seemed like a really down-to-earth, salt-of-the-earth man, and I knew that his wife was sitting out in the waiting room because we hadn't allowed her to come in with him because COVID. And then when that initial storm settled, I realized that what I was also feeling was moral injury. You see, here's what I thought I was here to do. Eve Purdy, who is an emergency physician and an applied anthropologist who happens to work in my ED, earlier this year came up with this definition for what it means to be working in emergency medicine, and I found it succinct and comprehensive. But she said that in emergency medicine, we aim to capably navigate acuity and uncertainty together. Now, even if you don't work in emergency medicine, I'm hopeful that components of this definition resonate with you. We arrive with capability. We are well trained. We are well prepared. We are capable. We are well intentioned. Like I was that day with Ed. Like you are every time you turn up on shift to the ward or to your clinic. We negotiate and we navigate our way through patient illness and its trajectory. We come up with investigation lists. We formulate management plans, perhaps admission. And we do this in a system that is increasingly multifaceted and complex. In emergency, we deal with acuity, sometimes hyperacuity. Where you work might be less acute, but it's almost certainly as complex, if not more. And we do all of this through a haze of uncertainty. There are illness factors, there are patient factors. At any given time, there are environmental factors that are very fluid, the skill mix on our team, the noise, the crowding, etc. And we also deal with the uncertainty of our own internal frame of mind at any given moment. And in emergency medicine, we do this as a team. If you work in a hospital, you are almost certainly part of a team. And even if you work in solo practice, you probably rely on the support of a colleague, perhaps administrative staff. And then each of our teams interface with other professionals and other teams. And at the core of our team is our patient and their family. When we capably navigate acuity and uncertainty together, it's a great shift. But increasingly, we're not feeling it. This is stolen from Eve Purdy. But we're not capably, but barely, not navigating, but managing, sometimes fumbling through increasing acuity. We're shouldering unrelenting uncertainty, and we're not doing it together. That day that Ed came in, I was not capably navigating acuity and uncertainty with my team. None of us were, and we let him down. This is not our idea of who we are, nor this is not our idea of what we do, nor is it our idea of who we are. You see, we don't just do healthcare work. We are healthcare workers. We are allied health professionals. We are nurses. We are doctors. The sense of identity comes from our initial aspiration, this aspiration to be a part of something bigger than we are, to look after other people. It comes from those hard yards in our early years of training, and all of the sacrifices that we might have made in order to achieve those career milestones. It comes from figuring out what our values are and figuring out how to put those values into practice. Some of us even take an oath upon graduation, an oath that we will first do no harm. And then we get into our workplaces and we learn over time that in order to first do no harm consumes resource, it takes time, it costs money, commodities to which we might not always have access. We learn that in order to first do no harm, this might feel like an impossible goal in our healthcare systems of today. And so what we do is that we make compromises, we cut corners, we do our best with what we've got. Over time, we become a version of ourselves that we don't recognize. And our healthcare systems become a version of themselves that we don't recognize. What then is moral injury? Well, moral injury, simply put, is the gap between the care that we want to provide and the care that we feel equipped to provide. It's a term that was used initially to describe the response of soldiers who were returning to war. Soldiers who went out in their pursuit of peace, but in this pursuit of peace, they had to harm or injure or even kill other people. It is this act of perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. The journalist Joanne Silver put it more poetically and perhaps more viscerally, that moral injury represents a deep soul wound that pierces a person's identity, sense of morality, and relationship to society. Only about 5 years ago, a couple of North American clinicians, Talbot and Dean, extrapolated this concept to healthcare work and workers. The difference was that the moral injury experienced by healthcare workers was not the act of killing another in the context of war, but it was the act of failing to provide good quality patient care in the context of healthcare. It arises for a number of reasons, but in essence, it arises when our moral ideals, our sense that we are resilient, resourceful, compassionate people who are here to serve others, collides with the real world in which we have resource limitation, we have interpersonal conflict, we have a lack of autonomy, and we have hospital metrics and targets that do not seem aligned with actually delivering quality patient care. And over time, these collisions repetitively have a profound and cumulative impact upon us. How is moral injury different from burnout? Well, you may know that burnout consists of a triad, that is exhaustion, cynicism, and decreased work productivity. This is a really useful articulation for how we feel at times, but it can resonate poorly with us. It can resonate poorly with us because it suggests a failure at individual level, that perhaps we're not resilient, perhaps we're not resourceful. Moral injury, I guess, recognizes the fact that it is our systems that are broken, and it's our broken systems that cause us to be broken and not the other way around. Moral injury over time does impact upon our resilience. Not the resilience of us as individuals, because to paraphrase the words of Charlie Greentree, my inimitable colleague, we are astonishingly resilient. Moral injury threatens the resilience of our healthcare systems. So how then might we contend with this? I'm going to start by stating what is not the solution. Workplace well-being programs that focus on individual well-being are not the solution. I say this as a founder of the 1ED program at Gold Coast Health. Workplace well-being programs have their place, and certainly for us at the Gold Coast, I'd like to think that what it's achieved is normalizing the experience of being a healthcare worker and perhaps giving us permission to have exactly these kinds of conversations. But it was never going to be the miracle to insulate against system deficits. The solution, of course, lies with leadership that's willing to acknowledge the human cost and the psychological injury that comes from when we, as healthcare workers, have to balance out multiple allegiances, that to the patient, that to the system, and even trying to look after ourselves. The solution lies with healthcare systems that are willing to identify and actually fix the system failures that contribute to our injury. The system failures that feel like they've lost sight of this principle of patient as priority. But if we focus on that which we can control, or at least influence, still don't have any solutions, but I do have some ideas, and I guess some concepts that have helped me over recent times, and I hope might help you. And these ideas are based on teams, trade-offs, and tolerance. Number one is team. Eve Purdy again challenges us to consider that our teams are the buffer between our health system deficits and that which our patient needs. And I would extend Eve's idea to suggesting that our teams are also the buffer between our health system deficits and then our experiences as individuals in our workplaces. We might ask the question, how do things go right as often as they do? Why aren't we making more errors than we are? Why aren't we even more morally injured than we're feeling right now? And I think the answer lies within team. We are incredibly capable as individuals. We are even more capable as part of a team. And I think that working to hone some of our team-based processes and paying attention to those dynamics, perhaps by a start of shift huddle or an end of case debrief, even if all that this achieves is a little bit of sense making for us, then this can really mitigate against some of the system-based assaults that we experience. In order to find out more about this, I'd encourage you to attend Eve's keynote this evening, or to just Google her. She has a multitude of profound insights into this. My second idea is around trade-offs. Emergency physicians are experts at trade-off. And this means that while we chase some wins, we inherently accept some losses. Some weeks ago, I spent extra time with a patient who had suffered chronic pain. And it was a really gratifying interaction, and I hope that I made some kind of meaningful impact upon her and her family. In the meantime, another patient with chronic alcohol overuse with capacity discharged against medical advice. And that was the trade-off. In your line of work, you'll have trade-offs as well. It sucks, but it's the reality. And we hope that overall, the trade-offs we make maximize good and minimize harm. Our challenge, of course, is that our systems also need to accept these trade-offs. And we know, don't we, that by the way that error is handled sometimes, that our systems are not quite there yet. And my final idea is around tolerance. The dictionary defines tolerance as an acceptable deviation from a reasonable standard. Now, I must preface what I'm going to say about this by saying this is probably a mid to late career phase position. If I had had this kind of conversation with my younger self, or if I talked to a resident or registrar about embracing more tolerance, they would probably think it was a little bit of a cop-out. But I guess here's where I'm at with it. I feel like I've spent the last 25 years of my career trying to work out the bounds of my circle of control and my circle of influence. And having largely worked out where these boundaries are, the only way for me to now try and align these spheres with the sphere of concern, which apparently is the key to kind of functional being, is to master that sphere of concern. And this can mean only one thing. It can mean trying to contract my sphere of concern. Now, you might be thinking, well, doesn't that mean you've become more disengaged or more detached? And I think there is that risk that unfettered, this might lead you to care less. In fact, even when I practiced the stalk with Una and my husband, I asked the question, do I sound really bitter? Do I sound really cynical? Because the thing is, I don't want to sound that way, because I actually feel more engaged and more embracing of what it is I do than I have in a long time, if not ever. And how have I got there? I can't really give you a formula, unfortunately, but I think it's partly to do with just becoming pragmatic about what it is that I care about or can put my energy into at any given moment. And it's about becoming more deliberate in translating my desire for meaning and purpose into something that can be impactful in that moment. Teams, trade-offs, and tolerance are what saved Ed, and I guess what saved me in the end. After my miss on the triage chair, the teams whipped into action, not just ED, but ICU and anesthetics, and he was placed on ECMO. In the 2 hours that we worked on Ed feverishly in our resus room, it's probable that some patients in our waiting room left without being seen. I hope that they were okay, and that's the trade-off. Some days later, Ed woke up, and he was discharged in remarkably good health. I still feel a little bit injured about the intrinsic and extrinsic factors that led me to miss his myocardial infarction. But after some rumination and some reflection, I was able to enact a little bit of tolerance. I was able to accept that I had done my best in a system that is flawed, a system that sometimes feels like it sets us up for failure. I think that moral injury will always be an inherent part of working in healthcare. I guess I hope that by raising our awareness of it, it might equip us with the language to have conversations with each other and perhaps with our leaders. It might even just give us permission to experience it, and at an even more basic level, it might give us a way to conceptualize what it is we're feeling. So that even if we're not quite ready to refresh or thrive, then hopefully we can at least survive and stay alive, and so can our patients. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing with us, Shahina. Does anyone have any questions in the audience? So I have a question. What would you tell your just came out of medical school self who's looking at all of their seniors who are looking tired, exhausted, burnt out potentially, who are cutting down their hours, going overseas to conferences to escape, all those sort of things? What would you tell them would be their best way of thriving?
That's a really good question, Andy. I guess what I would tell them is that, there is no formula. There's a spectrum of experience. Different things work for different people at different times. We had a keynote speaker this morning who, encouraged us to say yes to opportunity, and I'm 100% on board with that. But she also made the point of being selective with which opportunities you say yes to, which is what I appreciated. I think my suggestion would be that they find their own way through it, but they don't do it alone. And I think having that support group of their peers, also their seniors and their mentors, to continue to check in with themselves and to check in with the people that they trust, and perhaps assigning someone to be their mirror of themselves, so that they can make objective assessments of how they're going at any given moment. And the point I'm making there is that sometimes we can insidiously just grind our way into a version of ourselves that we never intended to be and that we don't recognize. And I guess having that mirror can be your checkpoint. And so I'd say hang in, because while the system is broken, we still have all of our passion, and you look to those opportunities where you can get gratification for self in your workday, but look to those opportunities where you might be able to effect change on a greater level, even if it's just your little circle around you and not the whole world.
Does anyone else have any questions? Because I could just ask them all morning, that's fine.